She stood in the middle of the road, arms spread wide like a crucifixion against the dying light. Alone, trembling, with madness blazing in her eyes, as if the apocalypse itself was about to descend. And then the words that escaped her lips would shake an entire nation to its core. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The city's narrow alleys teemed with the usual evening crowds. Merchants closing their stalls, children playing in the fading light, the rhythmic sounds of daily life in Burkina Faso's capital. But no one knew that behind the veil of normalcy, a storm was brewing that would change everything. President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his armored vehicle, eyes closed, head resting against the cool glass. The weight of leadership had carved deep lines into his weathered face over the past 5 years. Beside him, Captain Umar methodically reviewed intelligence reports, his sharp eyes scanning each document with practiced precision. 2 more arrests today, Umar said in a low voice, breaking the comfortable silence. Kabore's men are still active, but the real mastermind remains elusive. He paused, studying Traoré's expression. Sir, we've been hunting shadows for months now. Traoré merely nodded, his mind elsewhere. Since the failed coup attempt 6 months ago, he hadn't slept peacefully for a single night. Every shadow seemed to conceal an assassin. Every whispered conversation felt like conspiracy. The paranoia was eating him alive, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, when the nation's stability hung by such a thin thread. The presidential convoy moved swiftly through the streets. 6 black SUVs with tinted windows, each carrying armed guards whose eyes constantly swept the surroundings. The security detail had been tripled since the coup attempt. Trust had become a luxury Traoré could no longer afford. The intelligence suggests Kabore might be planning something big, Umar continued, flipping through another report. Our sources in Ivory Coast have gone silent. That's never a good sign, Colonel Kabore. The name alone made Traoré's jaw clench. His former ally, his trusted friend, who had fled to Ivory Coast after the failed coup. A man who had shared meals at his table, who had sworn an oath to protect the nation, who had betrayed everything for money and power. The convoy was making good time through the less crowded parts of the city when suddenly, without warning, a figure appeared directly in front of the lead vehicle. "Stop the car!" Umar shouted, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The screech of brakes filled the air as the convoy came to an abrupt halt. Security personnel poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting commands in French and local dialects. But the woman remained perfectly still in the middle of the road, arms outstretched, her body trembling like a leaf in a storm. She was clearly pregnant, her belly prominent beneath tattered, dirt-stained clothing. Her hair was disheveled, hanging in wild tangles around her face. But it was her eyes that stopped everyone cold. They were filled with a terror so profound, so genuine, that it seemed to pierce through every defense. "Get back! Move away from the vehicle!" One of the guards barked, but the woman didn't budge. Her gaze was fixed on something beyond them, beyond the guns, beyond the shouting. She was looking directly at President Traoré through the bulletproof glass. Inside the vehicle, Umar's grip tightened on his weapon. "Sir, this could be a trap. She might be wearing a suicide vest. We should retreat immediately." But Traoré found himself staring into those desperate eyes, and something in their depths told him this was no act of terrorism. This was something else entirely, something more dangerous because it was real. "I need to talk to her," Traoré said, his voice carrying the authority that had led him through years of political turmoil. "Sir, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. We don't know what—" "I said I need to talk to her." Traoré's tone brooked no argument. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years. And right now, every instinct was screaming that this woman held information he desperately needed. The security team exchanged nervous glances as Traoré stepped out of the vehicle. The crowd that had gathered at a safe distance fell silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something momentous. The evening air was thick with tension, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked nervously. Traoré approached the woman slowly, his hands visible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "What's your name?" he asked in a strong, clear voice that carried across the silent street. The woman shuddered, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "My name is Sally," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant city sounds. "And I have something to tell you that could save your life." Traoré's heart skipped a beat. Behind him, he could hear Umar coordinating with the security team, but all of that seemed distant now. "What do you mean?" Sally glanced nervously at the convoy behind him, her eyes darting from vehicle to vehicle as if searching for something specific. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "They're going to kill you, tonight, and they're using me to get close to you." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Umar stepped forward, his weapon drawn but not aimed. Who's going to kill him?" Sally's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched her swollen belly protectively. "They said if I didn't cooperate, they would kill my baby." Her voice broke with emotion. "They promised me $1 million if I could deliver you to them." Traoré felt his blood turn to ice. "Who made this promise?" Sally's gaze drifted past his shoulder, focusing on something behind him. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, thick with fear and desperation. "The man sitting in the back seat of the third car in your convoy. He's not your protector. He's the one who sent me." The words hit Traoré like a physical blow. He turned slowly, his eyes fixing on the third vehicle in the convoy. Through its darkly tinted windows, he could make out the silhouette of a man he had known for years, someone who had been part of his inner circle since the day he took power. "What's his name?" Traoré asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Captain Issa," Sally said. And her next words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "And he's going to kill you tonight." President Traoré's hands clenched into fists as the magnitude of the betrayal began to sink in. Captain Issa, the man who had taken an oath to protect him, who had been at his side through every crisis, who had shared classified intelligence and strategic plans. If Sally was telling the truth, then the conspiracy went deeper than anyone had imagined. In the third vehicle, Captain Issa sat perfectly still, but Traoré could see the tension in his posture. Even through the tinted glass, their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, Traoré saw something that chilled him to the bone, cold, calculated murder. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding in their neighborhood. Vendors had abandoned their stalls, children had stopped their games, and even the ever-present street dogs seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. "Please," Sally whispered urgently, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have to believe me. He's going to make his move any moment now." As if responding to some invisible signal, the door of the third vehicle swung open with a sharp click. Captain Issa emerged slowly, his hand moving deliberately toward his weapon. But there was something different about him now. The mask of loyalty had slipped, revealing the predator beneath. "Everyone down!" Umar shouted, raising his weapon as chaos erupted on the street. But before Issa could draw his gun, Sally threw herself forward, grabbing Traoré's arm with surprising strength. "Run!" she screamed. "It's too late!" The street exploded into pandemonium. Captain Issa yanked his weapon free, his eyes wild with a mixture of determination and desperation. The other security personnel scrambled to form a protective barrier around their president, but the situation had descended into confusion. Who could be trusted when one of their own had turned traitor? Sally clung to Traoré's sleeve, her fingernails digging into the fabric. "Please believe me," she sobbed. "He's going to kill you. I couldn't let them use me for this." Issa's cold gaze fixed on Traoré, his weapon steady despite the chaos around him. His face was a mask of grim determination, sweat beading on his forehead, but his hand remained steady. "Sally, get away from him!" he barked. Sally's face crumpled with anguish. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I won't be part of murder." Traoré's sharp eyes quickly assessed the situation. "Your baby, is Issa the father?" Sally nodded miserably. "He promised we would leave Burkina Faso together. He said we would start a new life in Ivory Coast with Kabore's money. But I realize now it was all lies. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Kabore's reach extended far beyond what anyone had suspected. The failed coup hadn't been the end of his ambitions. It had been merely the beginning of a more sophisticated plan. Issa's jaw tightened as he heard Sally's confession. "You weren't supposed to tell him everything," he snarled. "You were just supposed to get him out of the vehicle." "You've ruined everything!" Sally collapsed to her knees, clutching her belly as sobs racked her body. "I had no choice. They threatened my baby's life. But I couldn't go through with murder, not even to save myself." The security cordon was tightening around Issa, but he seemed beyond caring. His years of careful planning were unraveling, and desperation was making him reckless. "Stand down, Captain," Umar commanded through a radio, his voice carrying across the tense standoff. "Do not fire! Repeat, do not fire! We need him alive for questioning." From inside one of the vehicles, radio chatter crackled with urgent updates. "Subject is armed and volatile. Civilian casualties possible. Request backup immediately." Traoré's gaze never left Issa's face. When he spoke, his voice was calm but filled with profound sadness. "You were like a brother to me. Why did it come to this?" Issa laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and painful in the evening air. "Brother, I watched you rise to glory while I rotted in your shadow. You became the hero while Sally and I struggled to survive on a soldier's wages." "Issa, please," Sally pleaded from her knees. "Think about our child. Think about our future." "There is no child," Issa suddenly roared, his composure finally cracking completely. "There never was." The crowd gasped in shock and Sally's face went white with horror. "What are you saying?" "Kabore told me that if I killed Traoré, I would get 10 million CFA francs. We would escape to Ivory Coast and live like kings. But you, Sally, you were always just a pawn in his game." Sally swayed on her knees, the full scope of the deception hitting her like a physical blow. "You lied about the pregnancy? About building a family together? Everything was a lie." Issa growled, his weapon still trained on Traoré. "Kabore wanted to humiliate you first, Mr. President. He wanted you to feel the betrayal of trusting the wrong people. He wanted you to feel as helpless as I've felt all these years." Sally doubled over, overcome by the crushing weight of the truth. "God forgive me. I thought you loved me. I thought we were going to be a family." Issa's eyes narrowed to slits, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Enough talking. Kabore said to put a bullet in your skull, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Tonight I finish what we started months ago." The gunshot cracked through the evening air like thunder. The crowd screamed and scattered. Traoré's body jerked, expecting the impact of a bullet, but he remained standing. Behind him, smoke curled from the barrel of a small pistol held by a young boy in ragged clothes, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. "You will not hurt him," the boy declared, his voice shaking but determined. "Not today. Not ever." Issa stared in shock at the unexpected intervention. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, thin and malnourished, but his stance was that of someone who had made peace with death. "Drop your weapon, Issa," Umar commanded as security forces rapidly closed in. "It's over." Issa's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his failure settled upon him. The gun slipped from his fingers and clattered to the pavement. Within seconds, the security team had tackled him to the ground, securing his hands behind his back with practiced efficiency. Traoré's attention turned to Sally, who remained collapsed on the road, weeping uncontrollably. The boy who had saved his life stood nearby, trembling, the smoking gun now lying at his feet. "What's your name, son?" Traoré asked gently. "My name is Amadou," the boy replied, his voice barely steady. "And they told me that if I didn't help you, they would kill my family too." Traoré knelt beside the boy, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Who told you this?" "The same people who used her," Amadou said, nodding toward Sally. "But they also said Kabore is here." "Somewhere close." "Closer than anyone thinks." The palace's interrogation room was cold and austere, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in stark, unforgiving clarity. Captain Issa sat shackled to a metal chair, his eyes hollow with defeat, blood seeping from a cut on his forehead. But his gaze remained defiant. Across from him, President Traoré sat behind a scarred wooden table, his eyes never leaving the man who had betrayed not just him, but everything they had once stood for together. Captain Umar paced behind him like a caged animal, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You committed treason," Traoré said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You swore an oath to protect this nation, to protect me, and you broke that oath for money." Isa's jaw muscle twitched. "Protection means service, and service means being treated with respect. You basked in the glory of power while those of us who kept you safe struggled in poverty." Umar slammed his fist on the table. "Who else is involved? How deep does this conspiracy go? You think it's just Kabore?" Isa's lips curved in a painful mockery of a smile. "You have no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes. The rot is everywhere, even in this very palace." "Enlighten us," Traoré said coldly. Isa's laugh was hollow and bitter. "There are people in this palace who would slit your throat for 1,000 francs. People who have been around you for years, people you trust completely." Umar's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Give me names!" But Isa's expression had gone blank, as if he had retreated somewhere beyond their reach. "You're already dead, Traoré. You just don't know it yet." Before Umar could respond, the door burst open and a guard rushed in, his face pale with urgency. "Sir, you need to come to the medical ward immediately. It's about the woman." In the medical ward, Sally lay on a narrow bed, her face ashen, her arms bruised and bandaged. A deep gash across her forehead had been stitched closed, but she was conscious and alert. Amadou sat beside her, holding her hand, his young face etched with concern. When Traoré and Umar entered, Sally's eyes flew open with desperate urgency. "President Traoré, he's here. The real killer is inside the palace right now." "Who attacked you, Sally?" Traoré asked gently. "Isa was just a decoy," she whispered, her breathing labored. "Someone wanted you to discover his betrayal. The real mastermind is someone you trust completely." "Who?" Sally's gaze shifted to Amadou, and the boy's face crumbled with anguish. "They told me to bring her here, said they would help her. But when we got here, that same person attacked us." Traoré felt ice form in his veins. "Who, Amadou?" Amadou's lips trembled as he looked up at Umar. "Captain Umar." The room fell into absolute silence. Umar's face went white, his eyes wide with shock. "This is insane. I was with you the entire time, Mr. President." But Amadou shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You told me to bring Sally to the medical ward. You said you would keep her safe. And then you—" The boy's voice broke. Sally struggled to sit up, her breathing becoming more labored. "He said Kabore would pay $1 million if—" Her eyes fluttered closed, then opened with tremendous effort. "The real killer is the one you trust, the one who knows your every move." Her eyes closed for the final time, and her body went limp. A single tear rolled down her cheek as her hand slipped from Amadou's grasp. "Take Captain Umar to the interrogation room immediately," Traoré commanded, his voice like steel. "I want him out of my sight." "Traoré, please, you have to believe me," Umar protested as guards moved to restrain him. "I'm not the traitor. This is all part of Kabore's plan to turn us against each other." But Traoré remained silent, his mind racing through the implications. If Umar was the traitor, then Sally and Amadou could also be part of an elaborate deception. Nothing could be taken at face value anymore. Amadou continued to sob beside Sally's still form. Traoré knelt beside the boy. "Tell me everything, Amadou. Who exactly told you that Umar was the killer?" "A man," Amadou whispered through his tears. "He said his name was Colonel Kabore." Traoré's blood ran cold. "Kabore? If he's in the palace, then Umar might be just another pawn in his game." Sirens wailed throughout the palace corridors as security forces swept every room. Every corridor searching for an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. In the interrogation room, Umar sat alone, shackled to the chair, sweat pouring down his face as he struggled against his bonds. Through the one-way glass, President Traoré watched his former right-hand man with growing uncertainty. Beside him, Amadou sat quietly, occasionally nodding when asked to confirm details of his story. "You're certain it was Umar who attacked Sally?" Traoré asked for the 4th time. Amadou nodded emphatically. "He was the one. He said Sally would be safe, and then he hurt her." Through the intercom, Umar's voice crackled with desperation. I didn't do this, Traoré. Please, you know me. This is all a setup. The question was whether Umar was telling the truth or simply playing his role in Kabore's elaborate deception. Trust had become impossible when everyone could be an enemy in disguise. Suddenly, a guard entered holding a small silver device. Sir, we found this hidden under Captain Umar's desk. It's a recording device that's been capturing conversations for weeks. Play it, Traoré ordered. The speakers crackled to life, and Umar's trembling voice filled the room. I won't do this. I can't betray Traoré, a second voice, cold and calculating, responded. You will do it, Umar, or your wife and children will never wake up again. Umar. Kabore. Please don't do this. Kabore, laughing. I have to do this. Traoré will die and you will take the blame for it. The recording ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. Amadou's eyes widened with shock. Umar had been coerced, just like Sally and himself. Traoré's shoulders sagged with the weight of understanding. Kabore had manipulated them all, turning them against each other while he remained hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings. Sir, I would never betray you willingly, Umar said through the intercom, his voice thick with emotion. He threatened my family. I had no choice. Traoré entered the interrogation room and looked into Umar's desperate eyes. I know, Umar. I believe you. At that moment, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the palace into darkness. Emergency alarms began blaring throughout the building, and radio chatter erupted from the security stations. Breach in the central corridor, a voice crackled over the radio. Unknown intruder in the main hall. Kabore, Umar whispered in the darkness. Traoré grabbed a weapon from the guard and headed for the door. Come on! Tonight we settle this once and for all. They ran through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors like gunshots in the night. The palace, once a symbol of stability and power, had become a maze of shadows and danger. Emergency lighting cast eerie red glows on the ornate walls, transforming familiar portraits of past presidents into sinister specters watching their desperate flight. Stay close, Traoré whispered to Amadou, who had insisted on coming with them despite the danger. The boy's young face was set with determination that belonged to someone much older. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the corridors, punctuated by shouted orders and the crash of breaking glass. Bodies of fallen guards littered the hallways, some wounded and moaning, others unconscious, but all victims of Kabore's final, desperate assault on the seat of power, sir, Umar whispered, his voice tight with tension. We should call for backup from the military garrison. No time, Traoré replied grimly. If we don't stop him now, there won't be a palace left to defend. They moved cautiously through the presidential wing, checking each room, each shadowy alcove where an assassin might be waiting. The palace that Traoré knew like his own home had become foreign territory, every corner potentially harboring death. As they approached the main hall, they could hear voices, Kabore's voice, calm and authoritative, giving orders to unseen accomplices. The man who had once sat at the same table as Traoré, sharing meals and planning the nation's future, was now orchestrating its destruction. How many men does he have with him? Amadou whispered. Umar held up his hand for silence, straining to hear the conversations ahead. At least 6, maybe more. Professional mercenaries by the sound of it. They reached the entrance to the grand hall, the ceremonial heart of the palace where state functions were held and foreign dignitaries received. Through the partially open doors, they could see the devastation within, overturned furniture, shattered crystal chandeliers, and in the center of it all, Colonel Kabore himself. He was a tall man in his 50s, his gray hair impeccably styled despite the chaos around him. Even in betrayal, he maintained the bearing of a career military officer. He wore a black tactical vest over his uniform, and his movements were precise and economical, the movements of a man who had planned this moment down to the last detail. Remember, he was saying to someone out of their line of sight, the charges are set on the main support columns. When I give the signal, this entire wing comes down. Make sure the president's body is found in the rubble. It needs to look like he died trying to defend his palace. Traoré felt his blood turn to ice. Traoré wasn't just planning an assassination. He was planning to destroy the entire government infrastructure and make it look like a tragic accident during a terrorist attack. "Sir," Umar breathed in his ear, "we need to evacuate the building. If those charges go off, we stop him here," Traoré said firmly. "If we run now, he wins. The nation falls into chaos, and everything we've built gets destroyed." Amadou tugged at Traoré's sleeve. "There's another way into the hall," he whispered. "I used to sneak through the service corridors when I worked in the kitchens. I can get behind them." "Absolutely not," Traoré said immediately. "It's too dangerous." But the boy's eyes were already blazing with the same determination that had saved them all earlier. "They used me to hurt people I care about. Now I want to help save them." Before anyone could stop him, Amadou had slipped away into the shadows, moving with the silent grace of someone who had learned to be invisible in order to survive. "Damn it," Umar cursed under his breath. "We have to move now before that kid gets himself killed." They burst through the doors into the grand hall, weapons raised. "Traoré!" Traoré shouted. "It's over." The scene before them was like something from a nightmare. The magnificent hall, with its soaring ceilings and marble columns, had been turned into a military command center. Maps were spread across makeshift tables, radio equipment crackled with communications, and armed mercenaries in tactical gear were positioned at strategic points throughout the room. Colonel Traoré turned slowly, his eyes dark with malice and something that might have been sadness. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old friendship turned to bitter hatred. "Ibrahim," he said, using Traoré's first name with mocking familiarity, "you always were too trusting, too willing to believe that people could be loyal out of principle rather than profit." "We were friends once," Traoré said, keeping his weapon trained on Traoré, but not yet firing. "Brothers in arms. We fought for this country's independence together." Traoré's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Friends? You became president while I remained a colonel. You lived in a palace while I struggled to feed my family on a soldier's pension. Friendship means nothing when one friend has everything and the other has nothing." Behind Traoré, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in black tactical gear, her face hidden behind a military-style mask. In her hands, she held a device that made Traoré's heart stop, a remote detonator with multiple switches, her thumb poised over what appeared to be a master trigger. "Meet Dr. Keita," Traoré said, with dark satisfaction. "One of the finest demolitions experts in West Africa. Former Ivorian military like myself. Unlike you, she understands that loyalty can be bought and sold like any other commodity." Dr. Keita's voice was cold and professional. "The charges are placed at 12 strategic points throughout the palace. One press of this button and this entire building becomes rubble within 30 seconds. Your legacy, your government, your life, all reduced to dust and memories." The magnitude of the threat was staggering. If those explosives detonated, not only would they die, but the destruction of the palace would create a power vacuum that would plunge the entire nation into chaos. Neighboring countries might intervene, claiming to restore order, but actually seeking to exploit the situation for their own gain. "What do you want?" Traoré asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Justice," Traoré replied simply. "For 30 years, I watched you climb higher while I remained in the shadows. You took credit for victories I helped win. You received honors that should have been mine. And when you became president, you forgot the men who made it possible." "That's not true, and you know it," Traoré said. "You were offered positions in the new government. You turned them down because you offered me scraps." Traoré roared, his composure finally cracking. "Deputy minister positions, ceremonial roles with no real power. You kept the real authority for yourself and your civilian friends." It was an old wound, Traoré realized. A festering resentment that had grown over decades, fed by perceived slights and imagined injustices. Traoré had convinced himself that he was the victim, that everything he was doing was justified. "So you decided to destroy everything we built together?" Traoré asked. "I decided to take what should have been mine from the beginning," Traoré corrected. "With you gone, the military will take control. And as the senior surviving officer with connections to international backers, I will naturally emerge as the new leader. Dr. Keita shifted impatiently. Enough talking, Colonel. Let's finish this. But Kabore held up a hand. No, let him understand completely. Let him see how thoroughly he's been outmaneuvered. He gestured around the room, where his mercenaries maintained their positions, professional and deadly. This isn't just about revenge, Ibrahim. This is about geopolitics. There are people, governments, corporations, criminal organizations, who would benefit greatly from instability in Burkina Faso. Our uranium deposits, our gold mines, our strategic location, all of it becomes accessible when there's no strong central government to regulate access. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Kabore's personal grievances. He was part of a much larger network of interests that saw Burkina Faso as a prize to be carved up and exploited. You're working with foreign powers, Traoré said, the pieces falling into place. This whole thing is about opening up our natural resources to international exploitation. Kabore's smile was cold and triumphant. The Chinese want our minerals. The French want to maintain their sphere of influence. The Americans want to prevent terrorist groups from establishing bases here. Everyone wants something, and they're willing to pay handsomely for it. And you're willing to sell out your own country for money. I'm willing to be realistic about how the world works, Kabore countered. Idealism is a luxury for people who don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. As they talked, Traoré was acutely aware that time was running out. Every second that passed was another second for Kabore to change his mind and detonate the explosives. He needed to keep the colonel talking while hoping that help would arrive, or that some opportunity would present itself. What about the people? Traoré asked. The citizens who will suffer when foreign corporations strip mine our resources and exploit our labor? The people will adapt, Kabore said dismissively. They always do. At least under a military government, there will be order. No more of this democratic chaos where every decision takes months of debate. You mean no more freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. Freedom is another luxury for people who don't have to worry about security, Kabore replied. Sometimes strong leadership requires hard choices. Dr. Keita was becoming increasingly agitated. Colonel, we need to move. Every minute we delay increases the risk of discovery. But before Kabore could respond, the lights went out completely, plunging the hall into total darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the scene even more surreal. What the hell? One of the mercenaries started to say. That's when Amadou struck. From the shadows emerged the small figure they had all forgotten about. Amadou, moving with the stealth and determination of someone who had learned to survive by being invisible. He had indeed found his way through the service corridors, but instead of attacking directly, he had used his knowledge of the palace's infrastructure to cut the main power lines. In the confusion of the blackout, he launched himself not at Kabore or the mercenaries, but at Dr. Keita, the one person whose death could prevent the explosives from being detonated. Leave them alone, the boy shouted, his young voice cracking with emotion as he tackled the demolitions expert around the waist. Dr. Keita, caught completely off guard by the unexpected attack, stumbled backward. The remote detonator flew from her hands, clattering across the marble floor and sliding under an overturned table. You little bastard! Kabore snarled, raising his pistol toward the boy. But Amadou was already moving, his small size and agility allowing him to dodge between the adults. He scrambled after the detonator, knowing instinctively that whoever controlled it controlled the outcome of the night. The hall erupted into chaos. Mercenaries shouted orders, trying to coordinate in the dim red lighting. Umar opened fire, his muzzle flashes strobing through the darkness. Traoré dove for cover behind a marble pillar, returning fire while trying to keep track of Amadou's position. Kabore's military training kicked in, and he began barking orders to his men with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Secure the detonator! Kill the boy! Do not let them escape! But Dr. Keita was already moving, her own training telling her that the detonator was the most important element in the room. She scrambled after Amadou, who had managed to reach the overturned table and was desperately feeling around underneath it in the darkness. Got it, Amadou called out triumphantly, his small hands closing around the device. Dr. Keita lunged for him, her superior size and strength seeming to guarantee victory. But Amadou had grown up on the streets, where survival meant being faster and more cunning than people twice his size. He rolled away from her grasp, clutching the detonator to his chest like a precious treasure. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," he shouted. Kabore, realizing that his entire plan was unraveling because of one determined child, abandoned all pretense of military discipline. He charged toward Amadou, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Give me that device, you little street rat!" But Traoré was already moving, emerging from behind his pillar with his weapon trained on his former friend. "It's over, Kabore. Your mercenaries are outnumbered. Your demolitions expert is disarmed and reinforcements are on the way." Indeed, the sound of sirens and vehicle engines could now be heard approaching the palace. Someone, perhaps one of the guards who had escaped Kabore's initial assault, had managed to call for military backup. Kabore's eyes darted around the room, taking in the tactical situation with the practiced eye of a career soldier. His mercenaries were pinned down by crossfire, from Umar and several palace guards who had rallied to defend their president. Dr. Keita was still trying to reach Amadou, but was being hampered by overturned furniture and her own injuries from the "Boys tackle, you think you've won?" Kabore asked, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "I think you've lost," Traoré replied. "The question is whether you surrender now or make this harder on everyone." For a moment, it seemed as though Kabore might see reason. His shoulders sagged slightly, and the gun in his hand wavered. But then his expression hardened again, and Traoré saw the look of a man who had decided to go down fighting. "If I can't have the presidency," Kabore said quietly, "then no one can." He raised his weapon, but not toward Traoré or Umar. Instead, he aimed at Amadou, the boy who held the key to everyone's survival. "Drop the detonator, boy, or I'll put a bullet in your head." Amadou looked up from where he crouched behind the overturned table, his young face pale but determined. "No," he said simply. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Kabore's finger tightened on the trigger. Traoré desperately tried to get a clear shot, but the colonel was using one of his own mercenaries as cover. Then Amadou did something that surprised everyone in the room. He smiled. "You made one mistake," the boy said, holding up the detonator so everyone could see it clearly. "What mistake?" Kabore demanded. Amadou's smile widened. "You assumed I didn't know how these things work." He held up his other hand, revealing a small cluster of wires that he had somehow managed to pull out of the device. "My father was a mining engineer before he died. He taught me about explosives." Dr. Keita's face went white as she realized what the boy had done. "He's disabled the remote trigger," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "The charges can only be detonated manually now." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Without the remote detonator, Kabore's plan had become useless. He could still try to reach the explosives and set them off individually, but that would take time that would allow everyone else to escape, and time that would expose him to capture. Kabore's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of grudging respect. "You clever little bastard," he said almost admiringly. "It's over," Traoré said again, stepping closer with his weapon still trained on Kabore. "Surrender now, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial." For a moment it looked as though Kabore might actually comply. His gun hand dropped slightly and his military bearing seemed to reassert itself. But then his radio crackled to life, and a voice spoke in rapid French. "Colonel, this is Strike Team 2. We have secured the presidential residence and are holding the First Lady and her children. Await further orders." The blood drained from Traoré's face. His wife and children? Kabore had taken his family hostage? "Surprised?" Kabore asked, his confidence returning. "Did you really think I would put all my faith in one plan? The explosives were just insurance. My real leverage is much more personal." He keyed his radio. "Strike Team 2, this is Colonel Kabore. If I don't report in within 10 minutes, execute all hostages and burn the residence to the ground." The game had changed completely. Suddenly, Kabore was back in control, and everyone else was dancing to his tune. The silence in the hall was deafening after Kabore's radio transmission. Traoré felt the world tilt around him as the full implications hit home. His wife, Fatou, and their two young children, 8-year-old Mariam and 6-year-old Abdul, were in the hands of mercenaries who had been given orders to kill them. "You bastard," Umar snarled. His weapon trained on Traoré. "Using children as leverage, even for someone like you, that's low." Traoré's expression had gone cold and professional again. "I told you this wasn't just about revenge, Captain. This is about power, and power requires decisive action. Sentiment is a weakness that I can't afford." Amadou, still clutching the disabled detonator, looked between the adults with growing understanding. "He has your family?" he asked Traoré quietly. Traoré nodded, his mind racing through possibilities. The presidential residence was 15 minutes away by car, surrounded by its own security detail. But if Traoré's people had gotten inside, they had probably neutralized the guards first. "A direct assault would likely result in the hostages being killed. What do you want?" Traoré asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Simple," Traoré replied. "You come with me." Quietly, peacefully. "You make a statement on national television announcing your resignation due to threats against your family. You endorse me as your chosen successor, and then you disappear into comfortable exile somewhere far away. And my family will be safely reunited with you once you're out of the country and no longer a threat to the new order." It was a lie, of course. Traoré knew that once Traoré had what he wanted, there would be no reason to keep any of them alive. Dead martyrs were often more useful than living critics. But what choice did he have? If he refused, his children would die. If he agreed, they might live long enough for him to find another way to save them. "I need proof that they're alive," Traoré said. Traoré smiled coldly and keyed his radio again. "Strike Team 2, put the woman on the line." A few seconds later, Fatou's voice crackled through the static, tight with fear but trying to sound brave. "Ibrahim? Ibrahim, are you there?" "I'm here," Traoré said, his voice barely steady. "Are you hurt? Are the children okay?" We're fine. They haven't hurt us. But Ibrahim, don't do whatever they want you to do. Don't let them—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the mercenary's voice. "That's enough. Colonel, awaiting your orders." "Stand by," Traoré replied, then looked at Traoré with satisfaction. "As you can hear, they're alive and well for now. But my men are professionals, President Traoré. They won't hesitate to follow orders, no matter how distasteful." Traoré felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him. As a leader, his duty was to the nation, to the millions of people who depended on stable government and democratic institutions. But as a father and husband, his duty was to his family, to the people who depended on him for their very lives. "If I agree," he said slowly, "how do I know you'll keep your word about my family?" "You don't," Traoré said bluntly. "But you know what will happen if you refuse." "Your choice, Mr. President." Umar stepped closer to Traoré, his voice urgent and low. "Sir, you can't trust him. He's going to kill them anyway and then destroy the country. There has to be another way, but what other way could there be? Even if they could somehow overpower Traoré and his remaining mercenaries, the strike team at the residence would carry out their orders as soon as they lost contact with their commander. That's when Amadou spoke up, his young voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "There is another way," he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at the boy, who was studying the disabled detonator in his hands with intense concentration. "What are you talking about?" Traoré demanded. Amadou looked up, his eyes bright with an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "The charges you planted, they're connected to a secondary system, aren't they? In case the remote fails?" Dr. Keita nodded reluctantly. "Standard procedure. There's a manual backup system that can trigger all charges simultaneously from a central control point." "Where?" Amadou asked. "The Palace Communications Center," she said, then immediately realized she had given away crucial information. Amadou's smile was grim but determined. "The communications center is also connected to the city's emergency broadcast network, and the police radio system, and the military command frequency." Understanding dawned on several faces at once. The boy wasn't just thinking about the explosives. He was thinking about communication, about getting word to the strike team that their colonel had been captured. "You want to broadcast a surrender order from Traoré," Umar said, catching on to the plan. "Not exactly," Amadou replied. "I want to make them think their colonel is dead." The audacity of the plan was staggering. If they could somehow reach the communications center and send a fake message to the strike team, they might be able to convince the mercenaries to abort their mission. But it would require precise timing, technical knowledge, and a lot of luck. "It'll never work," Traoré said, but there was less certainty in his voice than before. "My men are professionals. They won't be fooled by amateur theatrics." "Maybe not," Amadou agreed, "but they'll be confused. And confusion creates opportunities." Traoré looked at the boy with new respect. Amadou had already saved them twice tonight, first by warning him about the conspiracy, then by disabling the detonator. Could this street-smart child really have come up with a plan to save his family as well? "Even if we could reach the communications center," Umar said, "how do we convince them that Traoré is dead?" Amadou held up the detonator again. "We don't have to convince them he's dead. We just have to make them think the mission has failed, and they need to extract immediately." He looked at Dr. Keita with calculating eyes. "You know the radio protocols, don't you? The code words, the procedures for emergency evacuation." The demolitions expert's face had gone pale. She was beginning to understand that her expertise was about to be used against her own mission. "I won't help you," she said defiantly. "Then people are going to die," Amadou said simply, "including children who never did anything wrong." For the first time since the crisis began, Dr. Keita seemed to waver. Whatever her motivations for joining Traoré's conspiracy, the prospect of dead children was apparently not something she was comfortable with. "The communications center is 3 floors up," she said reluctantly, "but it's heavily secured. You'll never get past the encryption protocols." "Leave that to me," Amadou said with quiet confidence. Traoré made his decision. It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than surrendering to Traoré and hoping for mercy that would never come. "Umar, take half the guards and secure a path to the communications center. I'll stay here and keep Traoré occupied." "Sir, I can't leave you alone with them." "You're not leaving me alone," Traoré said, nodding toward Amadou. "I have backup." The boy straightened his shoulders, looking far older than his 16 years. "We can do this," he said with quiet determination. "We have to do this." As Umar and his team prepared to move out, Traoré's radio crackled again. "Colonel, this is Strike Team 2. We're receiving conflicting radio traffic. Request confirmation of current mission status. Time was running out. Whatever they were going to do, they had to do it now." "Go," Traoré told Umar, "and God help us all." The communications center was located in the palace's north tower, a heavily fortified room that served as the nerve center for all government communications during emergencies. As Umar led his team through the service corridors, they could hear the sounds of battle echoing from other parts of the building. Traoré's remaining mercenaries were making their final stand. Behind them, in the main hall, President Traoré kept Traoré talking, while Amadou worked feverishly on something that might save them all. The boy had produced a small toolkit from somewhere, probably salvaged from his days working in the palace kitchens, and was carefully examining the disabled detonator. "You know," Traoré said conversationally, as if they were old friends catching up over coffee, "I actually admired you once. When we were young officers, fighting for independence, I thought you were the kind of leader this country needed." "What changed?" Traoré asked, genuinely curious despite everything. "Reality," Traoré replied bitterly. "I realized that idealism is a luxury for people who don't have to worry about feeding their families on a soldier's salary while politicians live in palaces." Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Umar's team had reached the communications center. The door was locked with both physical keys and electronic security, but the palace guards knew the override codes. Within minutes, they were inside the room filled with radio equipment, computer terminals, and satellite communication arrays. Amadou said to patch into the emergency broadcast network. Umar told the technician who had joined their team. "Can we simulate a radio transmission from Traoré?" The technician, a nervous young man named Musa, examined the equipment. We can create a transmission on the same frequency his mercenaries are using, but we'll need to know their call signs and protocols. Back in the main hall, Dr. Keita was becoming increasingly agitated as she watched Amadou work on the detonator. "What is that boy doing?" she demanded. "Learning," Amadou replied without looking up. "My father always said that if you understand how something works, you can make it work differently." He had managed to trace several wires from the device's internal circuitry, and was now connecting them to a small electronic device that looked like it had been salvaged from an old radio. "Dr. Keita, what frequency do your people use for emergency communications?" "I'm not telling you anything," she said defiantly. Amadou looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. "Ma'am, there are children about to die because of your mission. Children who never hurt anyone. Are you really going to let that happen because you don't want to admit you made a mistake?" Something in the boy's voice seemed to reach her. After a long moment, she said quietly, "Channel 7, emergency frequency 445.7 MHz. Call sign, Desert Storm." In the communications center, Musa quickly tuned the radio equipment to the correct frequency. "I've got them," he whispered to Umar. "They're using military-grade encryption, but I can break through it." "What do we say?" Umar asked. That's when Amadou's voice crackled through their own radio system. "Tell them the mission is compromised. Tell them to extract immediately and leave no witnesses." Umar understood immediately. If the strike team believed their mission had failed and they were in danger of being captured, their priority would shift from holding hostages to escaping safely. Musa began typing rapidly, setting up the transmission. "This is risky," he warned. "If they figure out it's a fake message, they'll probably kill the hostages immediately. And if we do nothing, they'll definitely kill them," Umar replied grimly. "Send the message." The transmission went out over the airwaves, disguised as an emergency communication from Colonel Kabore himself. "Desert Storm, this is Colonel. Mission compromised. Palace security has broken our encryption. Extract immediately. Leave no evidence. Confirm receipt." For several agonizing minutes, there was no response. Then finally, a crackling voice came back. "Colonel, this is Desert Storm Leader." "Extraction in progress. What about the packages?" In the main hall, Dr. Keita had become Amadou's reluctant assistant, helping him modify the detonator's circuitry. "The packages are the hostages," she explained quietly. Standard mercenary terminology. Amadou looked up at Traoré. "What should we tell them?" It was a crucial moment. If they told the mercenaries to release the hostages, it might seem suspicious. But if they told them to kill the packages, they would be signing death warrants for his own family. "Tell them to secure the packages for potential future use," Traoré said after a moment's thought. "Make it sound like we might need them as bargaining chips later." Musa sent the follow-up message. "Secure packages for potential future operations. Do not eliminate unless directly threatened. Extraction remains priority 1. The response came quickly. "Understood, Colonel." Packages secured. Moving to extraction point Alpha. For the first time in hours, Traoré allowed himself to hope. If the mercenaries were moving to an extraction point, they would be taking his family with them, which meant his wife and children were still alive and might be rescued. But Kabore was listening to the radio chatter as well, and his expression was growing more suspicious by the minute. "That's not how I trained my men to communicate," he said slowly. "The protocol is wrong. The syntax is wrong." His eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. "You clever bastards," he said with grudging admiration. "You're impersonating me on the radio." He lunged for his own radio, but Amadou was faster. The boy had anticipated this moment and was ready. He activated the modified detonator, not to explode the charges, but to send out a powerful electromagnetic pulse that would disrupt all radio communications in the immediate area. The pulse worked exactly as Amadou had hoped. Every radio in the palace went silent, including Kabore's. But more importantly, it would also disrupt communications at the presidential residence, preventing the strike team from receiving any contradictory orders from their colonel. "You've bought us maybe 10 minutes, Dr. Keita said, looking at Amadou with something approaching respect. "After that, they'll switch to backup frequencies and realize they've been deceived. Then we'd better move fast," Traoré said. In the communications center, Umar was coordinating with military units that were now surrounding the presidential residence. The electromagnetic pulse had been their signal to begin the rescue operation. Strike teams Alpha and Bravo are in position, came the report over the emergency frequency. We have visual on 4 tangos holding 3 hostages in the main residence. Request permission to engage. Negative, Umar replied immediately. Wait for my signal. We need to confirm the hostages' safety first. Back in the main hall, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Kabore's remaining mercenaries had realized that something was wrong and were becoming increasingly agitated. Without radio communications, they couldn't coordinate their actions, but they were professional enough to understand that meant their position was compromised. Sir, one of the mercenaries called out to Kabore, we need to move now. Every minute we stay here increases the risk of capture. But Kabore was staring at Amadou with a mixture of fury and admiration. Where did you learn to do that? He demanded, gesturing at the modified detonator. My father taught me about electronics before he was killed in the mines, Amadou replied quietly. He said that understanding how things work was the only way to survive in a world where rich people try to keep poor people ignorant. The words hit Kabore like a physical blow. For a moment, his expression softened, as if he was remembering something from long ago. Your father was a wise man, he said quietly. Yes, he was, Amadou agreed. He also taught me that violence is what people resort to when they run out of better ideas. Traoré watched the exchange with growing hope. If they could somehow reach the human being buried beneath Kabore's bitterness and anger, perhaps this could end without more bloodshed. It doesn't have to end this way, Traoré said gently. We can find another solution. A way for everyone to walk away from this alive, Kabore laughed bitterly. You still don't understand, do you? This isn't just about me anymore. There are forces at work here that are much bigger than personal grievances or national politics. He gestured toward Dr. Keita and his remaining mercenaries. These people aren't working for me out of loyalty or ideology. They're working for organizations that see Burkina Faso as a resource to be exploited. If I fail, they'll just find someone else to carry out their plans. Then help us stop them, Traoré urged. You know who they are, how they operate? Work with us instead of against us. For a moment, it seemed as though Kabore might actually consider the offer. His military bearing reasserted itself, and he looked like the officer he had once been, dedicated, principled, willing to make hard choices for the greater good. But then Dr. Keita spoke up, her voice cold and practical. Colonel, we need to make a decision. Either we complete the mission or we abort and eliminate all evidence. The spell was broken. Kabore's expression hardened again, and he shook his head. It's too late for redemption, Ibrahim. I've crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges. The only way forward is through. He turned to his mercenaries. Prepare for final assault. We eliminate all witnesses and complete the mission. That's when the lights came back on. The palace's backup generators had finally kicked in, flooding the hall with brilliant white light that temporarily blinded everyone. In that moment of confusion, several things happened at once. Amadou triggered another pulse from his modified detonator, this time aimed not at disrupting communications, but at overloading the mercenaries' night vision equipment and electronic sights. Umar's voice crackled over the palace's public address system. All units, go! 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 And from outside came the sound of helicopters, military vehicles, and the coordinated assault of Burkina Faso's elite rescue units. The final battle had begun. The assault on the presidential residence was swift and professional. Military snipers had positioned themselves on surrounding buildings, while special forces teams approached from multiple angles. The mercenaries holding Traoré's family were skilled, but they were outnumbered and operating in unfamiliar territory. Tango 1 is moving toward the rear exit with Package Alpha, came the report over the radio. Package Alpha was the code name for Fatou, Traoré's wife. Intercept and neutralize, Umar commanded from the Palace Communications Center. Priority is hostage safety. In the main hall, the situation had devolved into a chaotic firefight. Kabore's mercenaries were making their last stand, but they were professionals who understood when a mission had failed. Their priority now was escape. not completion of objectives. Dr. Keita had taken cover behind an overturned table and was trying to reach the manual detonation controls for the explosives she had placed throughout the palace. If she could trigger them, she could still complete at least part of their mission, destroying the seat of government and throwing the country into chaos. But Amadou was one step ahead of her. He had spent the last few minutes not just disrupting communications, but also tracing the wiring for the explosive charges. His father's training in mining operations had taught him how demolition systems worked, and he had quietly been disconnecting key components. "Looking for these?" he called out, holding up a handful of detonator caps that he had somehow managed to remove from the charges. Dr. Keita's face went white with rage and desperation. Without the detonator caps, the explosives were just harmless chemicals. Months of planning had been undone by a 16-year-old boy with electronics knowledge and street smarts. Meanwhile, the radio crackled with updates from the residents. Package Bravo and Package Charlie secured. Those were the code names for Traoré's children. All packages are safe and en route to secure location. Traoré felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him to his knees. His family was safe. Whatever happened next, at least his wife and children would survive. Traoré, seeing his entire operation collapsing around him, made one final desperate gambit. He pulled a concealed pistol and aimed it not at Traoré, not at the guards, but at Amadou. "The boy dies unless you guarantee my safe passage out of the country," he declared. But he had underestimated Amadou one last time. The boy didn't freeze or cower. Instead, he smiled. The same calm, confident smile that had unnerved everyone all night. "Colonel," Amadou said quietly, "you're forgetting something important." "What's that?" "I'm not afraid of you anymore." And with that, he pressed one final button on his modified detonator. Instead of triggering explosives, it activated the palace's emergency lockdown system. Steel shutters slammed down over all windows and exits, trapping everyone inside until security forces could sort out who was friend and who was foe. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Several of the mercenaries, realizing they were completely trapped, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Dr. Keita, seeing that escape was impossible, began destroying documents and electronic equipment to prevent intelligence from falling into government hands. Only Traoré continued to resist, his pistol still trained on Amadou. "You think this changes anything? Even if you capture me, there will be others. The forces that want to control this country won't give up just because one operation failed." "Maybe not," Traoré admitted, slowly approaching with his hands visible and non-threatening. "But they'll have to find someone else to do their dirty work. And maybe next time we'll be better prepared. You're naive if you think—" Traoré never finished the sentence. Captain Umar, who had made his way back to the main hall during the chaos, tackled the colonel from behind. The pistol went off, but the bullet went wide, embedding itself harmlessly in the marble wall. Within minutes, it was over. Traoré and his surviving mercenaries were in custody, Dr. Keita was under arrest, and the palace was secure. Emergency medical teams were treating the wounded guards, while intelligence officers began the process of interrogating the prisoners and analyzing captured documents. But for Amadou, the victory felt hollow. He sat in a corner of the hall, still clutching his modified detonator, looking far older than his 16 years. Traoré approached him carefully. "You did it," he said gently. "You saved everyone, did I?" Amadou asked quietly. "Traoré was right about one thing. There will be others. People who want to exploit this country, who see our resources as something to be stolen rather than something that belongs to the people who live here." The president sat down beside the boy, suddenly feeling very tired. "You're probably right," he admitted. "But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight we stopped these particular bad guys. Sometimes that's all you can do. Take it one crisis at a time." Amadou nodded slowly. "My father used to say something like that. He said you can't fix the whole world, but you can fix the part of it that's right in front of you." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." He was. Amadou looked up at Traoré with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. What happens now? Do I go back to living on the streets? Traoré put a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. Not if I have anything to say about it. Heroes shouldn't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. Outside, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the clouds, casting golden light across the palace walls. The immediate crisis had passed, but the implications of the night's events would reverberate for months to come. The conspiracy had run deeper than anyone had imagined. Traoré's network had infiltrated the highest levels of government, and rooting out all the collaborators would take time, patience, and tremendous care. Trust would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. In the medical ward, Sally's body lay covered with a white sheet, a reminder of the human cost of political ambition and betrayal. She had been both victim and unwitting participant in Traoré's scheme, ultimately finding the courage to choose what was right, even at the cost of her own life. Amadou would be given a new home, a new family within the palace walls. His bravery had saved not just the president's life, but potentially the stability of the entire nation. He would grow up knowing that sometimes even the smallest person can make the biggest difference. Captain Umar returned to his duties, but the psychological scars of his coercion would take time to heal. The knowledge that his family had been threatened, that he had been forced to participate in a plot against his president, would haunt him for years to come. Captain Issa remained in custody, facing trial for treason. His story served as a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of resentment and the seductive power of easy money. President Traoré stood at his office window, watching the sun rise over Ouagadougou. The city was waking up, people beginning their daily routines, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. The burden of leadership felt heavier than ever, but so did the responsibility to protect and serve. The events of the night had taught him valuable lessons about trust, loyalty, and the price of power. He had learned that enemies could wear the faces of friends, that conspiracies could run deeper than anyone imagined, and that sometimes salvation could come from the most unexpected sources. But as he watched the golden light spread across his capital city, President Traoré also knew that new shadows were already forming. Traoré's final words echoed in his mind. You have enemies you don't even know about, and they're much closer than you think. The game of power never truly ended. It simply moved to a new board, with new players and new rules. And somewhere in those shadows, the next conspiracy was already taking shape, waiting for its moment to strike. The sun had risen on a new day, but in the world of politics and power, darkness was never far away. President Traoré straightened his shoulders and prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and that the shadows would always be waiting for their chance to return. As the golden dawn broke over Burkina Faso, a new chapter in the nation's history was beginning, one that would test the bonds of loyalty, the strength of leadership, and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when their country needed them most. The conspiracy had been exposed, the immediate threat neutralized, but the larger battle for the soul of the nation would continue. And in that battle, heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places, reminding everyone that in the end, it was not power or money that determined a nation's fate, but the courage and conviction of its people. The shadows had been illuminated, but new ones were already forming. The game continued, but at least now, President Traoré knew some of the rules.